of the 47th Conference of the Caribbean Studies Association here on St. Croix, Virgin Islands. How are we feeling? It's been a full day. It's been a full day. Tonight's plenary, this is the one plenary we are hosting in the evening with the special interest of encouraging the wider community of St. Croix to be able to be participatory. And the intention, as we have had 3 days, well, actually 4 days plus, full of sessions, activities, and so forth around the theme of transforming our Caribbean. This has given us a time of reflection, a time of deep thought, and also a time to explore radicalism in the Caribbean spaces. So tonight's plenary, really focusing on one of the, not just a cultural icon, but an authentic native son of St. Croix, Virgin Islands. Oftentimes an unsung hero, oftentimes completely erased from the history, the narrative of this space called St. Croix, and that is none other than Hubert Harrison. And I think it requires a moment of reflection and silence to even hold his spirit, his energy, his contributions, his achievements up very high. Grateful for that. So this theme tonight around this particular plenary for day 4 of the CSA St. Croix 2023 conference, Hubert Harrison and Caribbean radicalism. And I want to just highlight there was a lot of history and engagement with that because this is the, I'll call it the brainchild, the idea. How can we be in St. Croix and not celebrate Hubert Harrison? And that came from none other than the powerful, distinguished professor at Cornell University, Dr. Carol Boyce Davies. Round of applause, please. Now, we could do the long version of her bio, or we can do what I consider the version that we're going to use just for tonight's purposes, because I know we want to get right into some of the discussion, the presentations. After I saw more than 30 slides in Dr. Corba's presentation, I said, you gonna show all? So I just want to be respectful of everyone's time and engagement. How many people, by show of hands, are familiar with Hubert Harrison? So while you're sitting and listening, I encourage persons that aren't familiar, use your cellular devices while they're on mute, on vibrate preferably, and just kind of start to get your mind to thinking and tinkering. Dr. Carol Boyce Davies is also a past president of CSA, bringing a significant amount of her skill, talent, and expertise to this whole theme. So while we may not hear her present per se, the types of questions and engagements and interactions are going to be very inviting. So let's give her a very warm welcome as she begins this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. First of all, guys, I have to say thank you to Dr. Chen Zira for organizing this 47th conference of the Caribbean Studies Association. Please recognize that. And having done this myself, I know the question of thank you is often not around. And I want to be one of those on record as saying thank you for hosting us. Thank you to the people of St. Croix for welcoming us to your space, to your island, to your home. We are here because you have opened the doors to CSA to be here. And for those of us who've had to do these events, it's a lot of navigation to get the right support. To make sure you get funding. People promise, sometimes they do, and then they renege. There's a lot that goes on. So in other words, any shortcomings you see it as part of our process of always growing from CSA, Caribbean Studies Association, always trying to do better, always taking it further. Some setbacks, pandemics, all kind of stuff, but still we move further. So of course, because of my work on Claudia Jones, some of you would know, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, Hubert Harrison was always somewhere peripherally located. And I say this because one of the people who Claudia worked with, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, is pictured in Hubert Harrison's book, talking with her on a panel during a silk strike in New Jersey. So I always had this logic of Hubert Harrison somewhere around. And the other one is a more sexy, tantalizing piece, guys. And he allegedly, and Brian over there will probably talk a little bit about that. That is not really allegedly. He had an affair with Marcus Garvey's first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey. And there's a lot of sweet drama around that on both sides. But we're not going to go there this evening, unless y'all want to have different kind of conversation later after we present. But anyway, so Hubert Henry Harrison, for me, stood out as an iconic black left scholar. And I'm always critiquing Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, because in a way, technically Hubert Harrison was an available figure. However, thanks to the meticulous work of Jeff Perry, we have an amazing body of materials to really study and honor this son of St. Croix. Hubert Henry Harrison, 1883 to 1927, the person who actually named the new Negro movement. I'm going to repeat. The person who actually named the new Negro movement, otherwise called the Harlem Renaissance. And whenever I taught the Intro to Africana Studies, I would use Hubert Harrison, and I'd love to say this line because people are never really understanding the pivotal role he had in orienting Marcus Garvey. And for Rastas and serious devotees of Garveyism, they would be like, oh my God, somebody is being put ahead of Garvey. There's a chain of black intellectual presences, and we cannot deny his role in orienting Marcus Garvey. We'll talk about that as well later on. So anyway, Hubert Henry Harrison, 1883 to 1927, is the person who actually named the new Negro movement, which became the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. He was born in St. Croix on April 27, 1883, and migrated to New York at age 17 in 1900. Therefore, and thereafter, he became one of the most significant thinkers, writers, lecturers in the United States until his timely death at age 44. In between those short years, however, his impact on the development of African American and African Caribbean connections would be formidable. As such, Hubert Harrison needs to be reinstated in the Caribbean intellectual tradition in a strong way, and this is why my dear colleague Brian Meeks is also here, as one of its foremost contributors, particularly in a CSA conference held in his place of birth, St. Croix, Virgin Islands. We honor and recognize Jeff Perry's work in archiving Harrison's work, and of actually just making sure he reached out to anyone who could help him achieve those goals. So what we'll have before our two speakers come forward is a brief video discussion, and then I'll introduce video presentation, and then we'll introduce, I'll say a few words and then introduce Dr. Koba.
As well as his differences with black socialists publishing The Emancipated Act. And makes clear that Harrison's writings and literary influence, including his book review, his Poetry for the People columns, contributed significantly to the climate leading up to Alain Locke's 1925 publication of The New Negro. That was a more literary publication. Right. Harrison's was literary and political. And Tony Martin, another outstanding historian, who writes on literary Garveyism, says in this period, the Negro World was the most outstanding literary publication of the era, but it was also incredibly political. But Martin, at the time he wrote that, didn't know that Harrison was the principal editor, because those documents only came. Martin has passed away, unfortunately, but point of no, the third session covers the years 1922 to 24, focuses on Harrison's prolific and wide-ranging writing and speaking efforts as an independent freelance educator, including his work as a public lecturer with the New York City Board of Education. For over 4 years, he was a Board of Education lecturer. That was a principal form. A lot of black people working during the day. If they want to get an education of some sort, they go to classes at night. And they would often be in the libraries, 135th Street or elsewhere. And Harrison regularly lectures, part of Board of Education series. And I think he was the first regular Board of Education lecturer in New York City. I have friends to this day who are still struggling to get more black and Latin teachers into that New York City school system, because it's very important. But it also, in that period, starting in that period when he was doing that teaching, Harrison also wrote regular columns for the Boston Chronicle, which was a black weekly coming out of New York. He wrote a wonderful series. I think I put them all in the Harrison Reader, but I discussed them in the second volume of the biography. And finally, Part 4 covers 1924 to 1927 when he dies, and it examines his innovative and more broadly unitary efforts in the last years, including the founding of the International Colored Unity League and the Voice of the Negro. That's his last organization. Now, if I may, I just want to offer a little about the perspective of this book, but I can wait. You want me to do this? Or?
Actually, I want you to keep that straight.
My wife's like,
Whoa, whoa, that was crazy. I don't know what just happened.
It's like, please take it up. That's not here what's happening.
What I just wanted persons to really see and gather was the fact that Dr. Jeffrey Perry was considered, or is considered, he passed away September of 2022 and gave literally most of his adult life to doing research and incorporating, restoring the work of Hubert Harrison to the world. I think it's really important that there's just a moment of reflection on the work of Dr. Jeffrey Perry. That particular interview was an interview that we were able to host even in the midst of all of the pandemic affairs, because before 2020, he would frequent St. Croix to gather firsthand information and gather significant research, interview numbers of families and persons in St. Croix, in St. Thomas, in St. John, throughout the Virgin Islands to learn more about this Crucian son, Hubert Harrison. I think it's worthy of a round of applause in the honor of Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry. I'm going to take a second to just kind of highlight that there were some things that Dr. Perry used to share here, because his concern was what was going to happen to this wide reservoir of resources that were left. There's papers he did not get to publish. There were papers that the family has kept, and there are some of those papers that are part of the Columbia University's archives, and there's some that are in private collections. And it's been very interesting that here in St. Croix, and I say it most of the time, we have to revisit how we engage in archiving our own narratives of our own native, indigenous, ancestral Virgin Islanders. And that's about anywhere. The conversation that was being had with Dr. Perry had a lot to do with just asking him, what would you like us to do? Because he had already known that he was ill. He knew that his time on the earth plane was limited, and he spent a significant amount of his time. It was amazing. This man would just go through archives after archives after archives and publish and write and publish and write and publish and write, even though he knew that his human body frame needed to rest. He had to be reminded to eat. And it used to be interesting. You could call him virtually any time, and he would tell you if he was tired. He said, if I answer the phone, it means I have energy, and I'm still alive. But this work on Harrison, for him, it was a very compelling piece, and I just really think it's important for persons to know that. So if you're not familiar with some of the materials, there was one piece, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. And then there was Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918. And while those two are from Columbia University Press, I encourage persons, if you have not learned about Hubert Harrison, if you claim to know anything about Caribbean studies, then you want to learn about Hubert Harrison because he was at the center. Many people refer to him as as a father of that whole thought process of whether it was the new Negro, the New World, the Harlem Renaissance, all of that. He was at the core. So it's and I say that because if we can easily remember all of these things in the States, and I'm going to be calling it straight, because we can say Martin Luther King backwards and forwards. If you're in the Virgin Islands or any part of the Caribbean, Hubert Harrison should be in the same space, right? And I just think it's really important. And I just wanted to make sure I said that as I finish my last part of my comment. And just keep in mind that the learning about Jeffrey B. Perry will facilitate you getting to a lot of the research, but also there's an actual archive that Dr. Perry left, which is free. It's completely public access to gather information, see some of the papers, see some of the letters, and there's an initiative now that is in place to translate it into at least 4 other languages, right? So I think it's very important that we do that. With that, I return this lectern to Dr. Carol Boyce Davies. I know you thought I was going to keep going, didn't you? No. It's been a long day. It's been a long day.
You know, when I had the idea to do a session on Harrison, normally with a conference host or president, you have to convince them that we should be doing this. With Chen, it's like, yeah, it was right away, and now I understand why. Of course, she herself was already doing some research and interviews with him. But what we can also add about Jeff Perry, amazingly generous. He came in, zoomed in during the pandemic to talk to my intro class, and I thought normally you want people to stay like half an hour. He stayed the entire class period and spent a lot of time trying to convince a lot of the predominantly white students about why they needed to do research on that topic as he has. So he was really clear about the racial question and how he was facilitating that work. So we are fortunate to have an amazing array of intellect right here. Dr. Brian Korber, who will speak first, is an assistant professor of African American history at the University of Memphis. Dr. Korber has a history of activism in social justice movements, including movements for LGBT equality, immigrants' rights, Palestine, the Green Party, climate justice, the movement for Black Lives, Occupy Wall Street, and World Peace. He was co-founder of the Rhodes Must Fall movement to decolonize education in Oxford, and also co-editor of the anthology Rhodes Must Fall, The Struggle to Decolonize the Racist Heart of Empire. Dr. Korber recently completed a year-long fellowship at the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and is currently working on a book titled Hubert Harrison and the Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, from which you'll present. You can put, thank you. Professor Brian Meeks is Professor of Africana Studies at Brown University and served as chair from 2015 to 2021. He previously served as Professor of Social and Political Change and Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. He has also taught at Michigan University, Florida International University with me as a visiting, Claudia Jones visiting professor, right, that we had created there, and Anton de Kom University of Suriname, and served as a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, Stanford, and Brown University. He has published 12 books and edited collections, including After the Post-Colonial Caribbean, Memory, Imagination, Hope, Critical Interventions in Caribbean Politics and Theory, Caribbean Revolutions and Revolutionary Theory, an assessment of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada titled Narratives of Resistance, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Caribbean, and Envisioning Caribbean Futures, Jamaican Perspectives. His novel, Paint the Town Red, was published in 2003, and his volume of poems, The Coop Clock Clicks, was published in 2018, and I know he has a new book as well that is not indicated here. So I will introduce Dr. Korba, Brian Korba, who will lead off the discussion. Dr. Korba.
That's okay. I thought I would take yours. Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. I just want to start by saying a huge, huge thanks and shout out to Dr. Carol Boyce Davies for really inviting me and encouraging me to do this presentation here. I've been wanting to be in St. Croix ever since I was a grad student and when I first started studying Harrison, and so this is a real full circle moment because it's my first time here, and I've been working on this for really 10 years. I started my program in 2013. So yeah, I'm emotional, I'm honored, I'm grateful, both to Professor CBD and also Dr. Chen and everyone who's made the CSA possible. I have a lot to say, so I just want to jump into it, if I may. Somebody had mentioned, I think Obi had mentioned J.A. Rogers and the importance of J.A. Rogers in popularizing Black history. This is what J.A. Rogers had to say about Harrison. Hubert Harrison is perhaps the greatest mind, the foremost African-American intellect, not just an Afro-American intellect, but one of America's greatest minds, yet even today only a very small proportion of the Negro intelligentsia has ever heard of him. Now what's crazy about this quote is it's from 1947, but it still applies today, right? So that's the contradiction that I'm hoping to help us resolve between this incredible and extraordinary figure who so few people still know about. So what I'm going to try to do is to just introduce some of the key insights and arguments and ideas of Harrison. I mean, there's a lot more that I could say than I have time for, and so I'm going to just try to give you some nuggets to sort of work with. And I also know that many of you are familiar with Harrison, so hopefully the new stuff that I have worked on will also add to your knowledge too. So just starting from the beginning, as has been mentioned, Harrison was born here in St. Croix, a place called Estate Concordia, which is on the way to Frederiksted. If you're driving from here west, it's about 2/3 of the way, or maybe 3/4 of the way there, more or less. He had very humble beginnings. He had a 9th grade education. He was orphaned. Both his parents passed away when he was a teenager. So he ends up moving to New York to stay with his sister Mary, who had already moved there right at the turn of the 20th century. And this is interesting because going from St. Croix to this bustling metropolis of New York City was very much not just a geographic, but a sort of almost a temporal shift, in that he was all of a sudden in one of the most profound and sort of multifaceted cities and largest cities in the world. And this is, of course, a trend, right, that many Caribbean migrants are following. People from Jamaica, from Barbados, from a whole number of places are traveling in this period, early 20th century, to the US, places like Harlem, places like Florida, Chicago, Detroit, and other places. So just to say something quick about Harlem, I just want to sort of set the mood, so to speak. And so I'm going to play some music from this period and just show some images to kind of get us in the mood or sort of mentality and ethos of what Harlem was like in the early 20th century. As it becomes literally the largest and sort of most concentrated in the US, that is, of Black neighborhoods. So. Yeah, these are just some of the sights and sounds and figures of the period. Harlem becomes this nexus where all kinds of new stuff is happening. There's new churches, there's theater and artistic and dance groups, neighborhood associations, fraternal orders, political organizations, migrant support. People are coming not only from the Caribbean, but also from the southern US, right? Fleeing Jim Crow oppression and segregation in the US South. And so that's another sort of aspect of why Harlem becomes, as you saw, the sort of mecca for the new Negro. Street corner speaking was another major and fascinating feature of this period, which Harrison was a pioneer of in terms of Harlem. Speaking on street corners, literally to the masses in the street. There's stories of Harrison drawing such large crowds that they literally were blocking traffic at times as cars are trying to speed past and people are trying to listen to what Harrison has to say. I want to start as well by defining radical, because if we're talking about radicalism, it's good to know what we're talking about. So Ella Baker is a great guide in this regard. She says, for those who can't see the text in the back, in order for us poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means we're going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So in other words, going to the root of the problem, right? Not just surface change, but fundamental transformation, transformative change. So Harrison, he enters New York in the early 1900s, and he starts developing in a number of ways, intellectually and politically. And one of those is through the church lyceums and debating clubs that he encounters, where people are discussing a whole range of different topics. And one of the things he starts to do is become more critical of the church, and he becomes a free thinker, an agnostic, someone who is skeptical of religion in general and has a particular critique of Christianity for the ways in which it was perpetuating a sort of servile attitude, for the ways in which churches could evade paying taxes on their properties, and a whole number of things which we can talk more about in discussion. He writes this piece in 1910 criticizing Booker T. Washington, which ends up getting him fired from the post office. For those who know, the Tuskegee machine of Booker T. Washington was this way in which Washington was able to impose discipline by literally getting people fired who criticized him. So this leads Harrison into the Socialist Party. Again, I'm making longer stories short, so hopefully you'll bear with me. But Harrison is a major pioneer in the American Socialist Party. He's the first black voice to systematically write about socialism and the Negro, that is the relevance of socialism to black people, but also the importance of black people to socialism. As was mentioned by Carol Boyce Davies, he is participating in a lot of the strikes and struggles that are happening. This is a picture that she was referring to with Harrison literally sitting next to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I don't know if everyone can see it, but this is a strike of silk workers in Paterson, New Jersey. Massive strike, thousands and thousands of silk workers shutting down production. And he was the only black speaker on those platforms. Let me give you a sense of his ideas, what he was thinking about socialism, right? He says, under the old system of slavery, he's talking about, excuse me, the capitalist owned the man. Today he owns the tools with which the man must work. These tools are the factories, the mines, and the machines. The system that owns them owns you and me and all the rest of us, black, white, brown, red, and yellow. We can't live unless we have access to these tools, and our masters, the capitalists, see to it that we are separated from what we make. So that's, a sort of basic idea about the means of production, who owns, right? Workers not owning, workers being exploited. This is a fascinating quote. Whenever large groups of men find profit in injustice to other men, they will evolve a system of ethics to reconcile their minds to that injustice. They cannot continue to do wrong without calling that wrong right. That is why the capitalist class cannot even think justice, so far as the workers are concerned. And that is why men who think that they can see a social or economic advantage for themselves in the degradation of the Negro will continue to think that degradation right. I think this is a fascinating idea that where you're positioned in the economy actually can affect your thinking and whether you can even think justice for the people who are most affected by the system. Fast forward a little bit more, and we have Harrison. Oh, sorry, I didn't have the quote up, but there's the quote for those who want to see it. Fast forward a little bit more, Harrison ends up leaving the Socialist Party because, to make a long story short, he was trying to get them to take black workers more seriously, and racial politics, anti-racism, which they just weren't so interested in. So he ends up leaving the Socialist Party, and he devotes himself to a new organization that he founds called the Liberty League of Negro Americans. And this is a poster which shows sort of the initial call for the League. It says, "Stop lynching and disfranchisement in the land which we love and make the South safe for democracy." What you have to understand here is that this is 1917 when Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, has taken the US into World War I on the grounds that they're going to make the world safe for democracy. And so Harrison is riffing on that to say, well, how about we make the South safe for democracy, right, before we go out doing things in the world? Because at this time, as you know, the South had legalized segregation, lynching, disfranchisement, the whole Jim Crow system of racial oppression. So here's what's one of the things that's really, really important about the Liberty League. When Garvey comes to New York, he joins Harrison's Liberty League. Harrison's Liberty League is the first platform that gives Garvey a mass audience in Harlem, which becomes the UNIA headquarters, yeah? And Garvey learns a whole number of things from his time in Harrison's Liberty League. The race-first ideology, right? People sometimes forget that Garvey's initial project was to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. And he gets to the US, and he encounters Harrison in the Liberty League, to make a long story short, and he gets a whole reorientation on what to do and how. The race-first ideology comes right out of the Liberty League, the mass movement orientation, rather than building a brick-and-mortar operation, combining African Americans, African Caribbeans, and Africans of various national origins in a single organization. That is the Liberty League. The tricolor flag, right? Red, black, and green, which adorns the flag of Kenya, among many other African countries. The Liberty League had a tricolor of black, brown, and yellow to represent the people of colors of the world and their relationship. So Harrison talks about Garvey's flag being a riff on the Liberty League flag. Weekly paper, The Negro World. The Liberty League had a paper before The Negro World came out that inspired a whole number of new Negro newspapers. And then, of course, as I mentioned, just seeing Harlem as the Mecca, as the headquarters for the UNIA. Part of why Garvey makes Harlem the headquarters of the UNIA is because Harrison has done the preparatory work, preparing people in Harlem for the notion of race first, right? For the notion of collective self-help and combining across national lines. All right, let me keep going. So just to put it simply, Garvey's experience in the Liberty League really shifted his whole thinking about the UNIA, and I argue that Garvey may never have become the namesake of Garveyism, that is a global movement for black nationality, without Harrison's decisive influence. Here's an example of how Harrison ends up joining forces with Garvey, so to speak. Garvey invites him to edit the Negro World newspaper, which is the newspaper of the Garvey movement, the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, and African Communities League, which was the Garvey's organization. And